In the hush of the wilderness, beneath a canopy of stars, cold and eternal, the people of Israel wandered. Their footsteps stirred the dust of ancient promise, but their hearts often trembled with questions, unanswered, unbearable. Among them walked a man clothed not in armor, but in sacred threads. The high priest, keeper of mystery, servant between earth and heaven. On his breastplate shimmered two stones, Urim and Thummim. Placed close to his chest where pulse and presence met, they bore no name of power, only the silence of waiting. They were not jewels for display, not ornaments of ritual, but vessels of a deeper voice. Exodus 28:30 names them quietly, like a secret between God and his servant. Place the Urim and Thummim in the breastplate of judgment, it says, so that they may be over Aaron's heart when he enters the presence of the Lord. Why the heart? Because these stones were never meant to be tools for the clever. They were meant for the trembling, for the ones too tired to guess, too honest to pretend they knew. When questions crushed the soul, when fear outweighed logic, they asked. And when they asked, not with pride but with surrender, the stones responded. They did not glow for show. They glowed for sincerity. The wilderness was no place for illusions. It burned away the false. Here a nation was unmade and remade not by sword, but by the slow whisper of obedience. Those two stones were no magic. They were mercy. They were the Spirit's subtle path, neither forced nor flamboyant. Do you see it? A priest in linen standing in the hush of the tabernacle, breath slow, waiting, asking. Sometimes the answer came quickly, like light falling on water. Sometimes it was delayed, wrapped in patience, but it always came with purpose. Numbers 27:21 tells us that Joshua, Moses' successor, was to stand before Eleazar the priest, who will obtain decisions for him by inquiring of the Urim before the Lord. Even warriors needed wisdom. Even leaders needed the light of surrender. And so the stones endured, hidden not in vaults, but near the heart. Because the heart broken and contrite is where God still speaks. Today we do not carry Urim and Thummim on our garments, but the questions remain, and the silence still listens. Do you feel it? The pause between one breath and the next when you're unsure which road to take. The tremor in your soul when no one else sees your fear. That's where the stones once lived, not in temples of stone, but in the space between asking and trusting. The Spirit of God, who once hovered over the face of the deep, now waits in quiet places, in your quiet place, not with thunder, but with stillness, not with riddles, but with presence. He was not absent. He is listening. And sometimes, just sometimes, he answers through what we least expect. Two stones, a flicker, a yes, a no, and always love. The city of Keilah burned. Smoke curled into the morning sky like a broken prayer. The threshing floors, once full of grain, now lay empty, plundered by Philistine blades. Children wept in the shadows of fallen gates. Mothers clutched silence where bread should be. And David stood watching, not yet a king, not yet enthroned. Just a fugitive with a warrior's heart and a shepherd's grief. News had reached him in the wilderness. Keilah, a city of his own people, was under attack, and though he had no throne, no crown, no command from Saul, David felt the weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders like ash. But he did not move on instinct. He did not rush to glory. Instead, he turned to the one who wore the ephod, Abiathar, the priest. "Bring it," David said. The breastplate, the stones. He approached the Urim and Thummim, not as a prince claiming power, but as a servant seeking permission. "Shall I go and attack these Philistines?" His voice was steady, but inside, the wilderness trembled. And the stones answered, "Go." So clear, so sure. But clarity is not always company. His men hesitated. They looked at the flames of Keilah and the spear of Saul, and their courage faltered. "If we are afraid here in Judah," they said, "how much more if we go to Keilah?" David listened. And instead of pressing forward, he asked again, not because he doubted God, but because he knew how much rode on every decision. He asked again, and the stones did not change. "Go down to Keilah," came the verdict. "For I will deliver the Philistines into your hands." No thunder, no vision, just 2 stones resting in the folds of a priest's garment, and a promise. And so David went. He and his men struck with the silence of obedience and the strength of divine certainty. They saved the people of Keilah. They rescued what remained. And for a moment, amidst the smoke and sorrow, victory whispered God's name. Not because David was bold, but because he had dared to ask. Because he had listened not to the noise of fear, but to the stillness of truth. But safety is always a fragile thing. David had saved Keilah. Yet peace lasted only as long as Saul's shadow stayed distant. Word came again, this time not of Philistines, but of Saul himself. He was coming, not with celebration, with spears, not to thank the liberator, but to bind him. In the stone streets of Keilah, David felt the wind shift. The same people he had just defended might soon hand him over. His breath shortened, not from fear of Saul, but from the betrayal he feared would bloom in familiar faces. So once more, he turned to the ephod. Abiathar stood silent, hands steady, as David approached the stones again. "O Lord God of Israel," David said, voice tight with urgency. "Saul is planning to come and destroy Keilah because of me. Will the people of Keilah hand me over to him? Will Saul actually come?" And the stones glowed. They spoke not in riddles, but in truth. "Yes," they said, "he will come." And then again, "Yes, they will betray you." No anger in that answer, only clarity. No condemnation, only a path. The Urim and Thummim did not lie. They did not comfort falsely. They did not protect his ego or flatter his sacrifices. They simply told the truth. And in that truth, David moved. He left Keilah before the trap could close, before Saul arrived. And by doing so, he preserved his calling, his life, his path, because he had asked, because he had listened, because he had trusted the voice, even when it wounded. Sometimes deliverance does not come by victory. Sometimes it comes by leaving in time. And sometimes the courage to walk away is greater than the courage to stand and fight. David's greatness was not only in his battles, but in his questions. He trusted the one who speaks through silence, through stone, through spirit. And you, when fear draws near and betrayal feels close, where do you turn? Do you still believe he speaks? If you feel the quiet invitation of God's voice, soft, sure, unwavering, don't leave just yet. This is only the beginning of the journey. Subscribe to Verse and Wisdom. Let ancient stories guide your steps, and may every question find its answer. But some truths cut deeper than the sword. David had asked, and God had answered. Yet the answer was not the one he hoped for. Keilah, the city he saved, would not shelter him. Their walls, though rebuilt, could not hold loyalty. So David fled, not in defeat, but in discernment. Because sometimes faith does not stay, it walks away before ruin arrives. And what happened next revealed not just the heart of a king in hiding, but the silence of a city unwilling to remember. Let us follow David as the fires of Keilah die down and the danger draws closer. Smoke still lingered in the stones. Keilah had been saved, its gates patched, its people spared. David had come not for tribute, but for rescue. And he had not asked for loyalty, only truth. But truth, like flame, can illuminate or consume. The same streets where children once screamed in fear now whispered David's name with suspicion. He was the reason they were spared. But now he was the reason Saul would come, not as a ruler, but as a threat. And in the hearts of Keilah's elders, a quiet calculation began. Would they protect the man who saved them, or trade him to the king who could destroy them? There were no open councils, no loud debates, only silent nods and turned backs. David felt it. The way warriors feel the wind before the arrow flies. The way shepherds sense the wolves in the tall grass. He had known betrayal before, but never so soon, so near. He could not ask the city for loyalty, but he could ask God for clarity. So he did. Again he stood before the ephod. Again he laid down pride and asked, "O Lord God of Israel, will the citizens of Keilah hand me over to Saul?" He did not beg. He did not bargain. He simply asked. And the stones did not delay. "They will." 2 words, heavy as iron, clear as morning. David had fought for this city, and now it would betray him. Not because they hated him, but because they feared Saul more. Loyalty, it seemed, was a luxury for safer times. And David, he did not rage. He did not curse. He did not force them to choose. He left. With his men, he slipped from the walls he had defended into the wilderness that had become his only ally. Because faith is not always staying. Sometimes it is going when the stones say go. Beneath the stars that had watched him since Bethlehem, David walked with the ache of clarity. Not every rescue is remembered. Not every loyalty survives fear. But God had spoken. And David once again listened. David did not look back. Not because he felt nothing, but because he had learned to trust God's answer even when it broke his heart. He and his men slipped into the hills, into shadows, shaped by centuries of wandering prophets and whispered promises. Keilah shrank behind them, its walls growing smaller with each step until it became nothing but memory and mercy. David had been betrayed, yes, but not destroyed, because he had asked and been warned. There is wisdom in surrender. Not the surrender of defeat, but the surrender of certainty, the kind that listens when God says, "Leave now." Sometimes we pray for doors to open, but forget to be thankful when they close. In that closing, David saw not rejection, but protection. He could have stayed. He could have fought. He could have turned Keilah into another battlefield, forced loyalty by blade and blood. But he didn't, because true authority does not demand. It discerns. And David, though anointed, chose humility over vengeance. As they moved through ravines and rock, his men followed not out of command, but out of trust. They had seen the ephod. They had heard the stones. And more than anything, they had witnessed David's obedience, even when the answer stung, even when it meant walking away from the city he saved. In the distance, Saul's army marched, but too late. David was gone. Led not by maps, but by the God who sees all turns before we take them. And perhaps in that moment, David began to understand that leadership, real leadership, wasn't just about slaying giants. It was about knowing when to stand still and when to move, when to speak and when to leave. There is a kind of glory that no one sees. No trumpets, no cheering crowds, no songs sung by the fire, only silence and obedience. David's path from Keilah led not to triumph, but to trust. In the world's eyes he fled, but in heaven's eyes he followed. The Urim had spoken, not with grandeur, but with truth. They will hand you over, simple, unforgiving, true. And David believed. He did not ask for a third sign. He did not test the answer with delay or second guessing. He walked. Because faith is not only believing God will fight your battles, it is believing Him when He says, "This is not your battle." Keilah would become a memory. But the choice David made there would become a milestone in his heart. He had spared the city, and in return they would have surrendered him. But David did not hold that against them, because he understood something deeper. Fear can make good people do desperate things, and God was still with him. Out there in the wilderness, among the caves and thorns, David would find something more precious than loyalty. He would find presence. Not everyone who celebrates your arrival will protect your calling. Not every rescue leads to reward. Sometimes God sends you to save a people, so you can learn to walk away from them. And sometimes the most holy path is the one no one claps for. Do not mistake obscurity for failure. David's retreat was not weakness, it was worship. It was a man listening and responding even when no one else understood. That's what makes a king in God's eyes. Not the throne, not the crown, but the willingness to ask and the courage to obey, even when it hurts. But not all who walk. Listen, not every man who bears God's name hears God's voice. David, a fugitive, had eyes to see because he chose to ask. But in another story, far from the hills of Judah, beneath the scorching sun of Moab, a prophet rode forward, blind, not by darkness, but by pride. And it would not be a king nor a priest who would open his eyes, but a creature humble, beaten, and full of unexpected vision. Let us follow Balaam now to a road where the unseen waits and a donkey begins to speak. The road twisted through the hills of Moab, dry and ancient, etched with silence. Dust rose with each hoofbeat, and at the center of it all rode Balaam, a prophet chosen, gifted, and lost. He had heard the voice of God before. He had spoken words that shook kings, but now his heart had begun to listen elsewhere. Gold, honor, fame. The elders of Midian had come with gifts, with promises. And though Balaam had said the right words, "Only what the Lord commands I shall speak," his heart leaned in a different direction. Not outwardly, but quietly, fatally. He saddled his donkey. He set out toward the court of Balak, king of Moab, a king desperate to curse Israel before they advanced further. And Balaam rode with a prophet's authority and a blind man's urgency. Because when desire clouds obedience, we no longer hear God clearly. We begin to hear echoes of our own ambition. The donkey beneath him trotted steadily, but she saw something Balaam could not. Ahead, invisible to the man, clear to the beast, stood an angel, sword drawn, eyes aflame. Still, he did not speak. He did not shout. He simply waited. The donkey veered off the path into the field. Balaam's pride flared. He struck her, not once, but again and again. Each time she resisted, each time she tried to save him, he responded not with gratitude, but with rage. The second time, the donkey pressed against a vineyard wall, crushing Balaam's foot. The third time, she collapsed altogether, and Balaam, furious, beat her with a staff. Do you see it? A prophet beating the very creature that saw the danger he could not. Because when pride blinds us, we despise correction, even if it comes from the lowliest place. And then a miracle. Not thunder, not fire, but words. From the donkey's mouth. Why have you struck me these 3 times? The air itself seemed to pause. The beast, simple, obedient, used not to carry glory, but to carry truth, had spoken. And the prophet listened. The donkey spoke, not with elegance, not with thunder, but with clarity. Why have you struck me these 3 times? And Balaam, a prophet, a seer, answered without hesitation, as though such things were common. You have made a fool of me, he said. If I had a sword in my hand, I would kill you right now. Still blind, still angry, still deaf to the miracle unfolding beneath him. But the donkey pressed further. Am I not your donkey on which you have ridden all your life until today? Have I ever been accustomed to do so to you? And Balaam, quiet now, answered, No. It was a small word, but in that one syllable something cracked. Pride begins to break when truth is spoken by the humble. And then the Lord opened Balaam's eyes. He saw what the donkey had seen all along. The angel, sword drawn, eyes fixed, standing in the path. And suddenly, Balaam saw the whole journey in reverse, the field, the war, the fall. They were not obstacles. They were interventions. They were grace in disguise. Mercy, dressed as inconvenience. And Balaam did what prophets must do when faced with the presence of God. He fell on his face. The angel did not console him, did not praise him for listening. He rebuked. Why have you struck your donkey these 3 times? Behold, I have come out to oppose you because your way is perverse before me. Perverse, a heavy word. not for what Balaam said, but for what he wanted. Even prophets can lose their path when the promise of gold blinds their eyes to glory. But God, in his relentless grace, used a creature of burden to restore the vision of his messenger. Not by power, not by position, but by humility. Sometimes God speaks through the fire, sometimes through the cloud, and sometimes through a donkey's cry, so that we who are proud might learn again how to listen. Balaam lay in the dust, a prophet once proud, now silent before the presence of truth. He had beaten the donkey, but the real wound was in his heart. The angel still holding the sword did not strike. Mercy stood where judgment could have fallen, but it came with condition. Go with the men, the angel said, but speak only the word that I tell you. Only the word. Not flattery, not fear, not ambition. This was not a license to speak. It was a leash, a holy one. Balaam rose slowly, not just from the ground, but from the illusion that his gift belonged to him. He looked at the donkey, bruised, exhausted, faithful, and for the first time, he understood. He was not the master of the message. He was the messenger of a master. So he rode on, toward Balak, toward gold he would not take, toward a stage he would not control. The road felt longer now, not because of distance, but because of awareness. He knew now what he carried. Not just prophecy, but accountability. Because when God spares you, he also assigns you. When he lets you go forward, it is never without purpose, and never without limits. Balak welcomed him with royal impatience. Why didn't you come sooner? He asked. Don't you know I can honor you greatly? But Balaam no longer bowed to such music. Have I now any power of my own to speak anything? He replied. The word that God puts in my mouth, that must I speak. That must I speak? It was no longer a rule. It was a reverence. Because once you've seen the sword, once you've heard the donkey, once you've faced the angel who did not strike, you do not forget. You do not pretend to know more than you're given. There are many who walk paths of calling, but few who remember that the gift does not make them gods. It makes them stewards. And stewards speak not their own will, but the will of him who sends. So Balaam continued, not with pride, but with permission, because mercy may let you live. But obedience is how you walk on. Some hear and obey. Some hear and still refuse. Balaam saw the sword and turned. But what happens when no sword is seen, no prophet is feared, and the heart refuses to tremble? What happens when a king lifts a golden cup crafted for holy hands and drinks from it in mockery? Not every judgment begins with thunder. Some arrive on a quiet night in the midst of laughter when the wine flows. And a hand appears without a body. Let us go now to the palace of Belshazzar, where light dances on the wall and the silence of God writes in fire. The palace pulsed with laughter. Torchlight flickered on stone. Golden goblets caught the shimmer of oil lamps, and music rose like incense lavish, layered loud. Belshazzar, son of Nebuchadnezzar, sat high above them all. Not just on a throne, but on a history he barely remembered. His father had bowed before the Most High. He had seen beasts in visions, trees fall in dreams, madness and restoration. But Belshazzar had only stories, and stories, when not believed, become nothing more than myth. So he threw a feast, not for celebration, for dominance. 1,000 nobles filled the hall. Wives, concubines, the air thick with wine and vanity. And in the midst of this intoxicated pride, Belshazzar gave a command, a reckless one. Bring me the sacred vessels, he said, the ones taken from the temple in Jerusalem. Goblets once touched by consecrated hands crafted for the house of God were paraded through drunken crowds. Laughter roared. And Belshazzar, the boy king with a borrowed crown, lifted a holy cup to his lips and drank, not in ignorance, but in defiance. Then he handed it off, to his wives, to his lords, to mock the God who once humbled his father. They praised gods of gold, silver, wood, stone. and the room swelled with confidence, with foolishness, with noise. But heaven was not silent. In the next moment, no trumpet sounded, no angel descended. Only a hand, no arm, no body. Just fingers writing, on plaster, on the wall, in the light of 1,000 flames. The laughter died, the music faded, and Belshazzar stared. His face turned pale, his knees buckled, his spirit broke. Because even kings know fear when heaven writes. The hand moved slowly but with certainty, as though judgment had waited long enough. And on the wall letters burned into the stone. Mene, mene, tekel, parson. Words no one could read, but everyone could feel. And the room once drunk with pride now drowned in dread. Not all warnings come before the fall. Some arrive during the final toast. The hall grew colder. The hand was gone. But the writing remained etched into stone, etched into the soul. Belshazzar trembled. He summoned the enchanters, the astrologers, the wise men of Babylon. And he offered riches, scarlet robes, golden chains, third place in the kingdom. Whoever reads this and tells me what it means, he declared, shall be rewarded. But no one moved. No one spoke. Because there are moments when human knowledge fails, when power stutters, when fear speaks louder than pride. Then the queen entered, not one of the concubines, but the queen mother, carrying the memory of a former king. There is a man in your kingdom, she said, in whom is the spirit of the holy gods. She spoke of Daniel, the interpreter of dreams, the one who had stood before Nebuchadnezzar when his reason was crumbling. So they brought him in, an old man now, grayed, steady. Daniel entered not as a supplicant, but as a servant of the Most High. Belshazzar tried to flatter him. I've heard of you, he said. You can read mysteries, interpret riddles. I will make you rich if you explain this writing. But Daniel's eyes did not flicker. His heart had not aged. Keep your gifts, he said. Give your rewards to someone else. But I will read the writing for the king and make known what it means. And before he spoke of the words, he spoke of the past, of Nebuchadnezzar, how he had been lifted up in greatness and then cast down in madness until he acknowledged the Most High God. But you, Belshazzar, Daniel said, have not humbled your heart, though you knew all this. You lifted yourself up against the Lord of heaven. You brought his holy vessels into this house of wine and praised gods who cannot see, hear, or understand. But the God in whose hand is your breath and all your ways you have not honored. And then Daniel turned to the wall, to the fire-burnt words, the verdict written by the invisible. Many. God has numbered your days and brought them to an end. Tekel, you have been weighed in the balances and found wanting. Peres, your kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and Persians. Each word a hammer, each pause a tolling bell. There was no call to repent, no second chance, only revelation. The time for mercy was past. The hand had written, heaven had spoken, and the night was not over yet. The writing did not fade. No servant came to clean it. No water could wash it. It remained silent, glowing eternal. Belshazzar stood frozen, a king stripped by words. And yet in the strange theater of pride he kept the ceremony. He clothed Daniel in scarlet, hung gold around his neck, declared him third in a kingdom already counted for death. But the prophet did not smile, because Daniel knew the reward of the wicked is no honor. That very night, while the torches still flickered in the banquet hall and the wine still soured in golden cups, the river gates were opened. The Medes, the Persians, they had waited at the walls not for battle, but for arrogance to blind the guards. And arrogance, as always, had obliged. They entered the city without a cry, without a clash of swords, just footsteps and judgment. In the hour before dawn, Belshazzar lay dead, not by political intrigue, not by rebellion, but by the hand that first wrote on the wall. He had seen the message, he had heard the meaning, but he did not bow. And so the night ended not with song, but with silence. his throne gone, his breath taken, his kingdom divided. Because the God who speaks also remembers. He remembers the vessels taken from his house. He remembers the pride of kings. He remembers the laughter that mocks his name. But he also remembers the faithful. Those who, like Daniel, speak not for reward, but because truth must be spoken. So when you lift a cup, be mindful of whose hands crafted it. And when you hear no thunder, do not assume silence means approval. For sometimes judgment waits behind a curtain of music, and the hand is already writing. If you feel the trembling of your soul when you hear these stories, perhaps it is not fear, but the invitation to remember who holds your breath. Subscribe to Verse and Wisdom, where stories warn and the word still speaks. Some fall because they never asked. Some are spared because they did. Belshazzar saw the writing and chose defiance, but others, long before judgment came, sought the light. Not the light of spectacle, not the fire of wrath, but the quiet gleam of a stone held to the heart, Urim and Thummim. They did not glow for power. They glowed for surrender. Let us return now to those ancient stones, not as talismans, but as invitations. For in them we do not find magic. We find guidance. They were just stones. No fire poured from them. No thunder answered their glow. They did not move. They did not speak. And yet they guided kings. Urim, Thummim, placed not in vaults, but near the heart of the high priest. Two stones held within the folds of sacred linen, resting against the very place where courage and fear collide. Their names mean lights and perfections, but they were not perfect in themselves. They were instruments, conduits for questions born not of curiosity, but of surrender. When David asked, the stones answered. When Joshua stood at the edge of war, they burned with certainty. But they did not answer everyone. Not always. Because these stones did not serve the bold. They served the broken, the honest. You could not shake them like dice and hope for divine magic. You could not demand. You could only inquire, gently, humbly, and wait. Unlike the fire on Sinai, the Urim and Thummim were quiet. Unlike the voice from the burning bush, they gave no commands. They responded, that was all. And perhaps that's the point. The stones were not meant to replace relationship. They were to support it. They were not shortcuts to God's will. They were symbols of the long road toward His presence. A road that begins with asking. There is a difference between signs that dazzle and lights that lead. The world longs for the spectacular, flames from heaven, miracles on demand. But God often chooses the slow burn, the quiet glow, the stone against the chest that whispers, this is the way, walk in it. And in that whisper there is more power than in all the noise of idols, because guidance, real guidance, is not about control. It is about trust. And trust grows when we ask not to be reassured, but to be realigned. We crave miracles. We want seas to part, bread to fall from heaven, dead to rise at command. We want to be certain, visible, dramatic. But God often whispers when we expect thunder. He gives not what dazzles, but what endures. The Urim and Thummim were not miracles. They were not spectacles. They did not part rivers or silence lions. But they gave direction, and that was enough. Because the true gift is not the dramatic intervention. It is the daily compass. Miracles may change a moment. Guidance changes a path. When the Israelites asked for signs, they often did so out of distrust. Prove yourself, they said. Show us again. But God had already spoken, already led, already revealed Himself. And so He gave them manna, just enough for each day. He gave cloud by day, fire by night, not to impress them, but to stay with them. And in that pattern we see the same spirit that glowed within two simple stones. Steady, sure, sufficient, not to entertain, but to lead. Perhaps that's the real miracle, that God still leads at all. That he bends low to answer questions we barely know how to ask. That he waits in the silence until we are quiet enough to listen. Guidance doesn't always come with clarity. Sometimes it comes with conviction, a restlessness in the spirit, a stirring in the word, a closing door, a flicker of peace on the path we least expected. And when we learn to trust that to see not with the eyes but with the heart, then we understand the purpose of the stones. They are not for show. They are for those who walk. One step, one answer, one act of trust at a time. The world wants certainty. We long for burning bushes, pillars of fire, angelic declarations. But the faithful, those who walk in the hush between promises, know another kind of light. The kind that does not shout. The kind that glows in the quiet, near the heart. Urim and Thummim. No one carries them now. The breastplate is gone. The tabernacle has faded into history. But the voice that once answered through stone still speaks. Not in Hebrew letters, not in supernatural glow, but in scripture, in spirit. In the still small voice that comes to those who ask in trust and wait in silence. It was never about the stones. It was about the one behind them. The one who saw David beneath the ephod, Balaam beside the donkey, Daniel in the hall of judgment. The one who does not need spectacles to reveal his will. Just your heart, willing, open, listening. So when you face a choice not between good and evil, but between fear and faith, ask. Not with demand, but with devotion. Not for proof, but for peace. And if the answer comes softly, receive it with reverence. For it is no less holy than fire on a mountain. It is guidance, and guidance is grace. Perhaps your questions are still unanswered. Perhaps you still wait, stone pressed against chest breath, held in longing. Subscribe to Versant Wisdom, where ancient lights still lead modern hearts, one quiet answer at a time. But what happens when no light glows? When the stones do not answer, the prophets are silent, the dreams dry up, and heaven does not speak. Not every silence is absence. Sometimes it is judgment. And in the shadow of a coming battle, as fear crushed even the strongest hearts, a king once anointed called out to God, but heard nothing. Let us walk with Saul into the valley where Urim gave no light and the silence became unbearable. The night before battle is never quiet, but this night was silent in a different way. The camp of Israel lay restless. Men sharpened blades with shaking hands. The Philistines had come in force, numbers like the sea, and Saul, the first king of Israel, walked among shadows that no torch could drive away. He had fought before. He had won before. But this was different. Because Saul was alone, not without soldiers, without voice. He had inquired of the Lord, but no answer came. No dream, no prophet, no Urim. Silence. The same God who had once anointed him with oil, given him victories, even filled him with his spirit, now stood still. Not because God had changed, but because Saul had turned too far, too long, too many times. He had once spared what God commanded him to destroy. He had once built monuments to his own name. He had once grown jealous of a young shepherd with a harp. And now, on the eve of ruin, he sought a word too late. The Urim did not glow. The silence was not passive. It was divine withholding. Because there comes a time when guidance no longer protects those who have refused to follow. So Saul did what once would have horrified him. He sought a medium, not a prophet, not a priest, a woman who called up the dead. Because when heaven goes quiet, the desperate seek noise elsewhere. And Saul, disguised trembling, entered her house, asking not for wisdom, but for Samuel, the prophet who had once anointed him, the prophet who had once rebuked him, the prophet who was now gone. But the dead do not forget. And when Samuel appeared, called not by magic, but allowed by mercy, he did not comfort. He judged. "Why have you disturbed me?" he asked. And Saul, broken, replied, "God has turned away from me and answers me no more. So I have called you." But the prophet gave no remedy, only reality. "Tomorrow," he said, "you and your sons shall be with me." The silence, it turned out, was not delay. It was sentence. And Saul, once chosen now, faced the last word he would ever receive. Morning broke like a blade. The valley of Jezreel shimmered beneath rising heat. But for Saul, the cold had already come. He stood atop Gilboa, a mountain that once watched over Israel's glory. Now it bore witness to its king's unraveling. The Philistines moved like a tide coordinated, relentless, hungry. And Saul, armor-clad yet hollow, watched as his sons fell. Jonathan, Abinadab, Malchishua. One by one the legacy crumbled. The heir of the throne, the loyal friend of David, gone. Saul saw, and in seeing something in him, collapsed. Not rage, not vengeance, emptiness. He turned to his armor-bearer, the last man left standing near him. "Draw your sword," he said. "Thrust me through, lest these uncircumcised come and abuse me." But the man refused. He feared more than Saul's request. He feared the judgment in the silence. So Saul, once chosen, once mighty, fell upon his own sword. It was not the blade that killed him. It was the absence of God, the absence of voice, the absence of future. Because when we live long enough ignoring the warnings, the silence becomes terminal. And with Saul's death, a chapter closed. Not just in history, in heaven's long story of kings. Sat, the Philistines found his body. They mocked him, stripped him, hung him on walls as if to declare that heaven had lost. But heaven does not lose. Heaven waits. And when it judges, it does not forget. It had warned. Through Samuel, through David's rising, through silence. And now the ground itself absorbed the truth God had spoken long before the sword did. They buried him in the night. The men of Jabesh Gilead, grateful for the Saul who once rescued them, risked everything to take his body down from the walls of shame. They burned him with honor, buried his bones beneath the tamarisk tree, and they wept, not just for a king, but for a beginning that ended in silence. Saul had once been called, had once prophesied, had once stood tall among the tribes. But calling does not guarantee communion, and kings, like all of us, must choose daily whom they listen to. The Urim had been silent, not out of cruelty, but because Saul had trained his ears to hear only himself. And in the final moment when he longed for divine direction, he found only echoes. What do we do when heaven grows quiet? Do we grow desperate? Do we seek answers in shadows? Or do we return to the last word God spoke and walk backward toward it? Because often God's silence is not the absence of love, but the fullness of truth already spoken. And if we ignore that truth long enough, it becomes the only voice we never hear again. So today, while the stones still glow, while the prophets still speak, while the word still lives, subscribe to Verse and Wisdom, not for noise, but for the still small voice that still calls. Saul heard nothing because God had withdrawn. But there is another silence recorded in Scripture, not born of judgment, but of strength. Not because heaven had turned away, but because heaven stood still, in flesh. A Roman governor asked questions, pressed, demanded, and the one who could summon angels who calmed storms with a word did not speak, not to defend, not to delay. Let us now enter that silence, not of abandonment, but of redemption. Let us stand before Pilate and listen to the silence of the Lamb. The hall was cold, stone, shadows, silence. Pilate sat upon the judgment seat, a Roman governor, a man of law, of empire, of politics. Before him stood a man bound, bloodied, beaten, Jesus of Nazareth, accused by priests, handed over by envy, brought not for truth, but for destruction. And yet, He did not beg. He did not resist. He stood. Pilate had seen many men rebels, murderers, zealots. Some spat, some cursed, some cried for mercy. But this one was still. Pilate asked, "Are you the king of the Jews?" And Jesus answered not with anger, but with questions. "Do you say this of your own accord? Or did others say it about me?" Pilate, agitated, pushed further. "Am I a Jew? Your own nation and the chief priests have delivered you to me. What have you done?" Jesus answered again, but not as one defending himself. "My kingdom is not of this world. If it were, his servants would fight. But they had not, because he would not." Pilate looked at him, this man with no army, no wealth, no defense. "So you are a king." And Jesus said, "You say that I am a king. For this purpose I was born, and for this purpose I have come into the world to bear witness to the truth. Everyone who is of the truth listens to my voice." Truth, the one thing empires cannot manufacture. The one power kings cannot control. Pilate scoffed. "What is truth?" But he didn't wait for an answer, because truth was standing before him. And truth at that moment chose silence. Jesus could have spoken one word and legions would fall, one breath and the ground would split. But he said nothing, because his silence was not surrender. It was strategy. It was sacrifice. He was not there to win the case. He was there to fulfill the covenant. So he stood, still, silent, strong. Not because he had no defense, but because he was the defense. For us. Pilate stepped back. He had judged many men, but this one confused him. There was no fear in Jesus' eyes, no panic, no plea, just calm, heavy with purpose. Pilate returned to the crowd. Priests, elders, citizens, anger. "What shall I do with the man you call the King of the Jews?" They screamed, "Crucify him." Pilate winced. Why? What evil has he done? But the crowd did not answer the question. They only repeated the sentence, "Crucify him." Mob voices grow louder when truth stands still, because silence reveals. It forces the listener to confront his own heart. And Pilate was afraid. He knew Jesus was innocent. His wife had sent word in haste, "Have nothing to do with that righteous man, for I have suffered much because of him in a dream today." But politics does not bend to dreams. Power does not bow easily. And the noise outside was growing. So Pilate tried one more tactic, a tradition. "Whom do you want me to release? Barabbas or Jesus, who is called the Christ? Barabbas, a rebel, a murderer." The crowd chose him, because when hearts are hard, they prefer violence over truth. And Jesus stood, still, silent, not because he had nothing to say, but because they had already chosen not to listen. So Pilate, fearing both riot and revelation, washed his hands. "I am innocent of this man's blood," he said. "But no water can cleanse a man who hands over the innocent for convenience." Then came the whip, the robe, the crown of thorns. Soldiers mocked him, struck him, spat on him. "Prophesy to us, O King." Still, he said nothing. Because some victories are not shouted, they are suffered. And Jesus had come not to argue for his innocence, but to stand in our guilt. Every lash, every thorn, every silence was spoken on our behalf. The cross was not yet raised, the sentence not yet nailed, but the judgment had fallen. And still he spoke not. Isaiah had seen it centuries before, like a lamb that is led to the slaughter, and like a sheep before its shearers is silent. So he opened not his mouth. In silence he bore the accusations. In silence he took the spit, the thorns, the robe. And when Pilate brought him out, beaten, bruised, mocked, he said, "Behold the man." But no one truly saw him. They saw a criminal, a rebel, a threat to their system. They did not see the Word made flesh choosing not to speak, because his mission was not to win the courtroom, but to break the curse. And we centuries later still struggle with his silence. We want him to explain, to protest, to rise in defense. But he doesn't, because he wasn't there for himself. He was there for us. And so he said nothing so that we might one day stand in grace. Well, some silences speak louder than sermons. Some wounds shine brighter than crowns. And some moments like this one invite not applause, but awe. If this silence moved you, if this moment stirred something quiet within, share what part of his silence speaks loudest to you in the comments below. We are still listening. He spoke from the mountain, in fire. He whispered through the stones, in light. He stayed silent before the governor, in love. From Balaam's donkey to Belshazzar's wall, from the glow of Urim to the hush before the cross. The voice of God has always spoken in more than words. And now the question is no longer, will he speak? The question is, will we listen? Let us gather now all that we've seen, all that we've heard, all that we've been warned, and enter the final silence not of absence but of awe. From Genesis to Gethsemane, from prophets to prisoners, from fire to silence, God speaks. Not always in the way we expect, not always when we demand, but always on time. He spoke to Balaam through a donkey to break pride. He wrote on Belshazzar's wall to bring down a kingdom. He gave light through Urim to guide those who asked. He withdrew from Saul to let silence carry the weight of his choices. And he stood before Pilate, wordless, wounded, waiting. Each voice, each silence, a message, each moment an echo of the same truth. God is not indifferent, he is deliberate. We often ask, why doesn't God speak to me? But perhaps the better question is, when he does, do I hear him? Do I pause when the whisper stirs? Do I yield when the word convicts? Do I trust the silence as much as I trust the sign? Because sometimes God speaks in thunder to shake us, and sometimes he stays quiet to sift us. What if every unanswered prayer is an invitation to examine the heart? What if every delay is a door still being shaped by unseen hands? What if silence is mercy, a pause to give us space to return, to remember, to listen? Because in his silence, God is still God. And in our listening, we become more than hearers. We become disciples. The world is loud. Voices clamor for attention. Algorithms feed urgency. News shouts. Fears echo. We scroll. We react. We speak often before we've truly heard. And somewhere in the middle of the noise, we whisper, God, where are you? But maybe God never stopped speaking. Maybe we stopped listening. He doesn't always speak through prophets anymore. No donkeys, no fire on mountains, no handwriting on the wall. But he still speaks. In the word alive and sharper than any sword. In the spirit quietly convicting, gently guiding. In people, friends who speak truth, strangers who confirm a burden. In creation, the morning light, the pause between raindrops, the stillness of a night where nothing moves, except your soul. But we only hear when we choose stillness. And stillness is not silence around us. It is surrender within us. What if hearing God isn't about technique, but posture? Not about trying harder, but bowing lower? What if the ones who hear best are those who've stopped demanding answers and started asking better questions? Not, what do you want me to do, but what are you showing me about you? The Spirit of God is not volume. He is presence. He is the whisper after the whirlwind, the breath after the battle. The glow after the fire has died down. And those who know him recognize that voice, because they've spent time in the quiet. So today, if his voice feels far, don't shout louder. Sit longer. Don't search for signs. Search the scriptures. Don't rush the silence. Let it do its work. For in the stillness, you may discover that the God you thought was distant was simply waiting for your heart to listen. He spoke in Eden and creation bloomed. He spoke on Sinai, and the mountain burned. He spoke through prophets, through parables, through prisons. He spoke from a manger, from a cross, from an empty tomb. And he still speaks, not in the same way, but with the same heart. Calling, warning, inviting. Not because he needs to be heard, but because he longs to be followed. The question was never, will God speak? It has always been, will I be quiet enough to hear? And when I hear, will I obey? In a world obsessed with volume, God still trusts the whisper. In a culture chasing clarity, he honors those who walk in faith. In an age demanding immediacy, he blesses those who wait. Because his voice is not for the clever, not for the proud. It is for the yielded, the humble, the ones who lean in. So pause. Right now, ask not for a miracle. Ask for a moment. Let the word search you. Let the Spirit steady you. Let the silence become sacred again. Because the God who thundered, who wrote in fire, who stood silent before the cross, that same God is still speaking. And maybe he's waiting for you to finally listen. Which voice of God moved you most in this journey? Share in the comments below. We're still listening. Together, before you go. If something in this journey spoke to you, a silence, a sentence, a single moment, stay with us. Here, we don't chase noise. We seek the voice. Stories that still breathe. Truth that still judges. And grace that still calls. Subscribe to Verse and Wisdom. Because the word was never meant to be visited. It was meant to be followed. And the journey is just beginning.